So, now you know about the basic framework of this cellular signaling. Let us now talk about a very important component of the cellular signaling, that is the receptors. So, receptors are those molecules which receives a signal and then either themselves undergo some changes or they then change the other moieties with which they interact. So, cell signaling, as I have told you, they allow the cells to respond to various stimuli, and this is the basic mechanism through which cell gets interacted with the environment in which it is living, and receptor plays major role in this. I mean, this is one of the most important component of the cellular signaling. The receptors then, after they get activated after binding with the ligand, they initiate different sort of reactions, and the binding of the ligands, as we have told you already, there are different molecules. They can be small ions, they can be small peptides, they can be hormones, and so on and so forth. They brings about change in the receptor in a way that a chemical reaction can start, or a signaling event can be elicited, can be started. One of the major type of receptors which are involved in the cellular signaling are the G protein coupled receptors, GPCRs. Why they are known as GPCRs? Because they activate small molecules known as G proteins which are present in the cell. So, if you see a cell, for instance, this is the membrane of the cell, and this structure, this seven segmented structure, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, this is known as these are the GPCR. They are quite complex and big molecules, and then somewhere downstream of these, just exact downstream of these, or immediate downstream of these receptors, are the G proteins which gets activated. They once activated, they then elicit or triggers a signaling pathway inside the cell. Example of these are the beta adrenergic receptors. They bind to the adrenaline, and which this increase this adrenaline hormone in turn increase the availability of glucose for its metabolism. It is also utilized in the initiation of what we say the MAP kinase pathway. So, cyclic AMP are actually the messenger molecules. This is one of the way of the action of these GPCR or G proteinic receptors, that they activate the cyclic AMPs, they give rise to the formation of cyclic AMPs, and the activation of these formation and also the activation of these cyclic AMPs then in turn triggers or activate other downstream molecules which lead to a response. So, in this way, this is one of the feature of these molecules, is that they and other receptor also, but specifically these receptors, that because of the cyclic AMP, because the cyclic AMP is produced in a large amount. So, in this way there is a proliferation of this whole signaling event also because of the production of cyclic AMP, and then from this cyclic AMP the downstream elements like protein kinase A, it is activated, which in turn then leads to the final response. For instance, it may be the activation of certain genes whose expression can give rise to the formation of certain proteins which can then give the response. So, in this way you can say that we can say that GPCRs, through the activation of the downstream elements, give rise to a signaling cascade. Then there is another class of receptors which is not as in terms of size as big as these ones, these as GPCRs. These are the RTKs, receptor tyrosine kinases. Now, receptor tyrosine kinases are also, in the same way as the GPCR act, similarly the receptor tyrosine kinase act in the sense that they also receive the signal, and this signal gives rise to the formation, gives rise to the activation, which then elicit a response. However, the major difference between the GPCR and the RTKs is that the RTKs, after binding with their ligand, they themselves then dimerize. They autophosphorylate each other. In the case of GPCR, these were G proteins which were linked with this GPCR, but here these RTKs, once the RTKs get bound with the ligand, they somehow dimerize, and this dimerization leads to their autophosphorylation, and this then leads to their activation, and then they activate their downstream elements. So, the scheme is almost the same in both. Once the receptor gets activated, they activate the downstream elements, and in this way the signaling cascade starts. But there are some differences which I have already mentioned. The major pathways which are initiated by the receptor tyrosine kinase, one of the very key pathway is the PI3 kinase AKT pathway. It also promotes the glucose uptake, which again, why glucose uptake is important, because it leads to the production of more and more energy, because glucose is the major energy producing compound. And then also are ion channel linked receptors, as the name shows. They are involved in the transportation of ions through the neurons, for example sodium ions, and these receptors are bound by certain neurotransmitters like acetylcholine, and these are the receptors which are specifically they are formed in a way, and their location is in a way that they then elicit a nervous response, a nerve based response. This is you can see that how different sort of receptors in different locations of the cells or different types of cells are involved in different sort of responses. Some responses have to be very rapid, as is the case with the ion channel link receptor. Some responses may need some time, before they get fine tuned, before they get really strengthened, and these signaling responses, mainly these are signaling responses which also involve the transcription of certain genes. So, talking about the diversity of the receptors, there are also some very important receptors known as the nuclear receptors, as the name shows. They are embedded into the nuclear membrane, and they are then involved in the signaling pathways which are involved in the, for instance, the transcription of the genes. One example is PPAR receptors, that is peroxisomal proliferator activated receptors. They bind the fatty acids, and of course, as a result, they are also involved in the metabolism of fatty acids, and they also are involved in the overall glucose homeostasis of the cell. Then also, if you take it at a bigger level, at a bigger picture, at a whole cellular level, or in the context of the whole body, these receptor and signaling based upon these receptors, they are involved in the maintenance of the overall homeostasis of your cell. तो ओवरऑल जो सेल में जो भी काम हो रहा है उसकी ओवरऑल उसकी हेल्थ का, उसकी वेल बीइंग के लिए दिस रिसेप्टर सिग्नलिंग इज वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट. The receptors respond to, for instance, nutrient changes. If there is a deficiency of nutrients, the receptors can give rise to signaling pathway or initiation of signaling pathway, which then give rise to the formation of more of those nutrients which are getting deficient. Or on the other hand, if there is an excess of nutrient, then these receptors can elicit a pathway which will inhibit those pathways, which leads to the formation of those nutrients. So, in this way, they adjust according to the demands of the cells, according to the energy demands of the cells. Any dysregulation of the receptors, and you can see lots of receptors are involved in many clinical manifestations, many clinical diseases, because they are the major crux of signaling pathways. So if these receptors are mutated or they are dysregulated, it will lead to diseases. One of the major, for example, is case is diabetes, in which somehow insulin is not been able to really involve in the storage of the glucose. And then they also contribute to the obesity, is again one of the way that you get more and more obese, is that there is some really problem in the signaling events which are initiated by these receptors, which can lead to deposition of extra fat in your body, or which can lead to the lack of the degradation of the fats. Then they are, of course, I mean, they are target of many, they are therapeutic targets of many diseases, for cancer, diabetes, you name it. I mean, because they are at the very center of the signaling events, and you will see it, and you have been seeing throughout this course. And if you go through any cell biology course or molecular cell biology course, you will see that how many drugs actually target the receptors for treatment. This shows the importance of these molecules, the receptor molecules, in the cellular signaling.